A flight attendant tried to humiliate a black CEO with a glass of wine. What happened next made the entire cabin fall silent. He thought shoving shattered glass into a man's mouth would silence him. He didn't realize the same shards he used would soon carve his own fate. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always cuts back. The moment the wheels left the tarmac, Darius Lennox felt something tighten, not in the cabin, but in the air between himself and the man 2 steps away. It wasn't turbulence nor cabin pressure. It was the stare, the kind that didn't glance but lingered. Flight 612 had barely begun to climb when Bryce Halden, tall, thin, and wiry beneath his Navy uniform, hovered near the first-class cabin wall, arms crossed and smile razor-thin. He wasn't scanning the rows like a professional flight attendant. He was watching Darius. Not in curiosity, not in politeness. There was a calculation in his eyes, like someone studying not a man, but a target. Darius adjusted the crutches tucked neatly beside his seat, feeling the weight of Bryce's gaze every time he moved. The crutches were residual, not needed to walk, but to protect the surgically repaired knee that sometimes locked up in colder air. He'd chosen a window seat deliberately, hoping for quiet reflection. After a week of draining government negotiations and high-pressure tech summits, this flight was supposed to be a pause, a rare chance to mentally rehearse the keynote he was due to deliver in New Vale on ethical automation, no less. But already, the tone of the cabin felt off. He glanced across the aisle. Bryce was still staring, now pretending to adjust a service drawer. A younger male attendant with a gentle face stood beside him, saying something Darius couldn't hear. Bryce didn't respond. His gaze remained anchored. Trying to ignore it, Darius opened his tablet and scanned his notes. The speech was a meticulous breakdown of algorithmic bias in AI-driven policing, a subject close to his heart, and one that had drawn controversy after Virion Systems secured a federal ethics contract. Darius had spent his life fighting to be respected, to be heard without having to shout. He wasn't about to let one man with a name tag and bad intentions distract him. But then Bryce moved closer. The flight attendants were preparing for beverage service. Trays clicked into place. Bryce took a step down the aisle only to pause beside Darius, glancing again at the crutches. "You okay over here?" he asked, voice coated in something not quite sarcasm, not quite concern. "I'm fine, thank you," Darius replied smoothly, not looking up. Bryce lingered a second too long, then walked away, chuckling under his breath. The laugh was low, nearly inaudible, but not to Darius. There was no humor in it, just mockery. 10 minutes passed. Bryce returned to the front of the cabin, whispering to the younger attendant. Darius couldn't hear the words, but he noticed how the younger man, whose badge read Felix, glanced at him with uncertain eyes. Felix nodded hesitantly, then moved to the galley. The engines hummed steadily beneath the fuselage, but inside the cabin, the quiet was deceptive. Darius reached down for his briefcase, ensuring it was still where he placed it, latched, sealed, and untouched. It held not just speech notes, but a hardware schematic for Virion's next AI integrity module, the kind of technology competitors would do anything to acquire or destroy. A light bump of turbulence stirred the overhead lights, flickering them for half a second. Darius didn't flinch, but Bryce did. He spun from his station and returned to first class briskly, pretending to check overhead bins while glancing, once again, at Darius. "Something wrong?" Darius finally asked, voice calm but firm. Bryce tilted his head with exaggerated surprise. "No, sir. Just keeping things safe. You've checked that same bin 3 times. Bryce's smile broke, just slightly. "Gotta stay thorough, especially when things get tense." "Turbulence doesn't equal tension," Darius said, turning back to his tablet. There was a pause. "That's so," Bryce murmured. Then he walked away, muttering something under his breath. Darius couldn't catch it fully, but he caught 2 words. "You people." He froze. His breath didn't hitch, his hand didn't move, but his mind sharpened. He'd heard it before. Not always those exact words, but the weight behind them. Dismissal dressed in politeness. Darius had built a reputation by never rising to bait, but that didn't mean he didn't recognize the hook. Across the aisle, Felix returned to his service tray, visibly nervous. Bryce barked something at him too harsh for the cabin's tone. Felix flinched. The plane leveled at cruising altitude. Light came through the windows in pale bands, casting long shadows. Darius pressed the attendant call button, more out of necessity than frustration. His throat was dry and the tension was rising like heat off asphalt. A minute passed. No one came. He pressed it again. Nothing. He looked toward the galley. Bryce stood there, arms folded, pretending not to see the light above Darius's seat. Passengers in adjacent rows glanced awkwardly at each other. Some began to sense the shift. Finally, Darius caught the eye of Felix and nodded once. A minute later, Felix approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry for the delay, sir," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "No trouble," Darius said. "Just a glass of water, please." Felix nodded, disappearing behind the curtain. When the water arrived, it wasn't Felix who delivered it. It was Bryce. The glass was filled to the brim, trembling at the surface. Bryce leaned slightly as he handed it over, as though daring Darius to spill it. "Your water," he said, his smile tight. "Thank you," Darius replied, his hand steady, his eyes locked on Bryce's. But Bryce didn't move. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, tone sharper this time. "I'm sure," Darius said. Bryce's lips twitched. "You look like the kind of man who's always sure." "Must be nice." There it was again. The dig, hidden beneath civility like a splinter beneath skin. Darius didn't respond. Then the plane hit a patch of air, and the glass shook. A thin line of water spilled onto Bryce's sleeve. Bryce looked down slowly. His smile vanished. His jaw clenched. He raised his head and stared at Darius as though insulted. Darius began to apologize, but before he could speak, Bryce turned and walked away without a word. Moments later, the distinct sound of shattering glass rang from the galley. Passengers flinched. The cabin grew quiet. When Bryce reappeared, he held another glass. This one gleamed, clear, flawless, except for a visible crack spiraling from the rim. He set it down without a word and turned away. Darius stared at the glass, then at the back of the retreating attendant. Something was wrong. This wasn't standard hostility. This was something colder, calculated. He looked back down at his notes, but the words swam. Not from fear, but from clarity. This flight was no longer about getting to New Vale. It was about getting there alive. He didn't know that this flight would soon turn from routine to survival. The cart rolled past Darius Lennox's row for the second time. He glanced up, calm but puzzled, watching as the flight attendant, tall, wiry, precise in movement, poured ginger ale for the passenger behind him, then pushed the cart along without a word or even a glance in his direction. Darius cleared his throat lightly, but Bryce Halden, the attendant, didn't flinch. Instead, he continued down the aisle as if Darius didn't exist. A few rows back, a middle-aged man in a charcoal blazer leaned into the aisle, frowning. Darius caught his eye, and the man gave a subtle shake of the head, as if to say, "You're not imagining it." Something was off. Darius sat back. His instincts, honed through years in boardrooms and negotiation tables, flickered to life. It wasn't just inattentiveness. It was deliberate. When Bryce returned, Felix Crane followed close behind, a young junior attendant carrying a tray of cups. Bryce snapped at him, sharp and low, for not stacking them in order. Felix mumbled an apology and shrank away like a scolded intern. Darius waited until the cart neared again. He kept his tone light, even courteous. "Excuse me. May I get a glass of water, please?" Bryce stopped. His lips tightened and his eyes scanned Darius's face like a searchlight looking for cracks. "Of course," he said. The words were polite, but the tone dripped with restraint. He poured the water slowly, almost theatrically. The stream rose to the very rim of the glass, too high for turbulence. Then, with a stiff arm and mechanical smile, he handed it over. "Careful," he said. "Don't spill it." Darius took it with steady hands. "Thank you," he replied, offering a courteous nod. Bryce's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile worn like a badge at the edge of contempt. He stared for a second longer than necessary, then turned away. Moments later, turbulence rumbled softly through the cabin. Nothing alarming, just a brief shudder. But it was enough. The glass trembled slightly in Darius's hand, and a few droplets leapt free, splashing onto Bryce's neatly ironed sleeve as he passed. The reaction was immediate. Bryce halted mid-step. His shoulders went rigid. His jaw clenched so tight the tendons along his neck rose in knots. Slowly, he turned his head, eyes locking onto Darius with such sharpness that for a second the cabin seemed to shrink. "You think you're above everyone, huh?" he muttered. Darius blinked. "Pardon." But Bryce had already turned again and walked briskly toward the galley. A few passengers leaned into the aisle, unsure if they had heard correctly. The murmur of the plane grew thinner, like air being sucked from the room. From the rear galley, the distinct sound of glass shattering rang out, sharp, jarring. Heads turned. No announcements followed. Darius straightened his blazer and set the half-empty glass onto his tray table. His mind sifted through possibilities. A bad day? Personal bias? Or something far more calculated? The latter tugged at him. When Bryce returned, he carried a new glass. This one had a jagged crack running down one side of the rim. He set it on Darius's tray with exaggerated care, his eyes holding a challenge. The fissure along the edge caught the overhead light, a small, glinting threat hiding in plain sight. Darius didn't touch it. "I asked for water," he said calmly. "That's what it is," Bryce replied. He leaned in just slightly, closer than etiquette allowed, closer than safety permitted. His breath, warm and sharp, brushed against Darius's cheek. "You people always act so perfect." There was no ambiguity now. The words cut with deliberate cruelty. Darius's hand slid toward the armrest not out of fear, but as a signal to center himself. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The nearby passengers had gone still. Even Felix stood frozen near the service area, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted. Darius spoke with quiet steel. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I suggest you step back." But Bryce didn't move. His lips curled into the faintest smirk, like a man who believed he held the upper hand and wanted to savor it. The air between them became heavy, dense, charged like a storm about to break. The humming engines faded into the background. What remained was the pressure of eyes, the silence of witnesses, and the single thread of restraint holding Bryce back from something unthinkable. Darius met his gaze without blinking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. But the tension, undeniable, electric, stretched so tight it was ready to snap. Across the aisle, someone shifted in their seat. Bryce finally stood upright again, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve, pretending nothing had happened. But his eyes lingered one last time, burning with a contempt that had only deepened. Darius did not respond. He picked up a napkin and folded it slowly, methodically, his breath even, his body still. He's unstable, Darius thought. But this isn't just about anger. This is personal. This is targeted. He looked down at the glass again, its crack now a symbol more than a hazard, something meant to provoke, to humiliate, to test. In that moment, Darius understood something deeper. This wasn't a clumsy act of bias. It was a performance, like Bryce had rehearsed it. And if it was rehearsed, then someone had scripted it. As Bryce walked away, back stiff with satisfaction, Darius's fingers brushed against the edge of the cracked glass. It was smooth on one side, sharp on the other. He wasn't afraid, but he was no longer just a passenger. The cabin lights dimmed overhead. Outside the window, the clouds drifted past like silent watchers, unaware of the war beginning in row 3A. Sometimes hatred doesn't roar, it whispers before it strikes. The cracked glass fell onto Darius's lap with a muted clatter that sliced through the low hum of the cabin. Cold water splashed against his suit as the rim fractured into uneven shards that shimmered under the cabin lights. Reflexively, Darius brushed the fragments aside, but a thin line of blood appeared across his palm. The sting was minor, yet the act itself was not. Around him, murmurs rippled through the rows, an audible unease that Bryce Halden seemed to absorb like fuel. His lips twitched into a smile that didn't belong in any place of service. "Stay seated, sir. Safety protocol," Bryce snapped at a passenger who had half risen to help. The command was sharp, rehearsed, meant to reassert control. The man sank back into his seat, uncertain whether this was a misunderstanding or something darker. Darius took a napkin from the tray table and pressed it gently against his palm. The crimson blot spread quickly across the white fabric, a quiet symbol of insult. "It's fine," Darius said softly, though his tone carried quiet authority. His voice wasn't pleading, it was measured, composed, an anchor against chaos. But Bryce's expression shifted. The calmness seemed to offend him more than anger ever could. He leaned in, close enough that Darius could smell the bitter coffee on his breath. "You think your money makes you untouchable?" he hissed. The words came through clenched teeth, his voice low enough to hide behind civility, yet sharp enough to wound. Darius looked up, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Let's not make a scene," he replied evenly. He wanted to de-escalate, to keep the situation from spiraling further, but the flight attendant's pupils had already constricted into something primal. There was no logic left, only intent. The next moments unfolded too quickly for thought. Bryce's hand darted to the service tray, fingers wrapping around the broken stem of a glass. The motion was so sudden it seemed choreographed. Passengers gasped as the shard glinted under the overhead light. "Sir, please." Felix Crane's trembling voice came from the galley, but it was already too late. Bryce lunged. The stem drove forward with terrifying precision, smashing into Darius's mouth. The world narrowed to the sound of glass against flesh. The jagged edge tore through his lips and gums. The copper taste of blood flooded his tongue. Pain seared through him like lightning. The force sent his head snapping sideways against the headrest. Gasps filled the cabin, one collective intake of horror. A woman cried out. A man fumbled for the call button. But Darius's instincts overrode the pain. He surged forward, his hand shooting up to grab Bryce's wrist. His grip was iron. The shard trembled between them, caught halfway between violence and restraint. Bryce's face twisted, not with fear, but disbelief, like a predator surprised its prey could fight back. The veins on his neck strained as he tried to push forward, but Darius turned his wrist sharply, forcing the man's hand back. The glass stem quivered in his grasp, its edges catching the faint light, reflecting blood and fury in equal measure. For a moment, time fractured with it. Darius could feel his heartbeat thudding in his jaw, could hear the rustle of passengers shifting, frozen between intervention and paralysis. His mind raced, not just with pain, but with calculation. This wasn't random. Bryce's movements had purpose, precision, the cadence of something rehearsed. "Bryce!" Felix shouted, voice cracking, stepping forward a single pace. "Stop! Please, stop!" But Bryce didn't move. His breathing came in sharp bursts, his body vibrating with rage. "Look at you," Bryce spat, his words trembling, still pretending to be calm. "You think you're better than me." Blood trickled down Darius's chin. His response was a rasp of restraint. "Put it down." Now the command hit the air like a gunshot. Passengers stiffened. Even Felix froze. For an instant, Bryce faltered. His eyes darted around, meeting the collective fear staring back at him. Then, with a broken laugh that curdled into anger, he yanked his wrist, trying to free himself. The shard slipped, slicing deeper into his own palm. Blood poured freely now, dripping onto the carpet between them. Darius forced his arm downward, twisting Bryce's wrist until the shard clattered to the floor. The sound was almost lost beneath the cries of panic. Bryce staggered back, clutching his bleeding hand, eyes wild. "Security!" someone yelled from the back. The call was useless at 30,000 feet. Felix moved at last, rushing forward, his hands shaking as he positioned himself between the two men. "Everyone, please remain calm," he shouted, voice cracking, but the order barely held against the chaos. Bryce's chest heaved as he glared at Darius, fury and confusion warring across his face. Darius remained seated, blood pooling on his tray table, his breath steady despite the pain. His jaw throbbed, his palm stung, but his composure held. That calm, the same calm that had won him boardrooms and battles, was now the only weapon he had left. Bryce took a step forward but stopped himself, trembling. The thin thread of control in him was fraying. Darius saw it in his eyes, the recognition that something inside him had broken beyond repair. The cabin was silent now, except for the faint hum of the engines and Bryce's ragged breathing. Darius wiped the blood from his mouth with the napkin, his movements slow, deliberate. He stared at Bryce, not with hatred, but with a piercing clarity that stripped the man of whatever power he thought he held. Even amid the wreckage of fear and pain, Darius sensed the truth. This wasn't just an outburst of anger. There was something behind it, something calculated. The glint of knowledge in Bryce's expression wasn't madness. It was familiarity, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Darius leaned back, feeling the cold air from the vent brush against the raw cuts on his face. Every instinct told him that this was only the beginning of something far larger. Felix's trembling hands hovered near the call button, his voice a whisper. "Sir, please, we need to get help." But Darius didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on Bryce, whose smirk flickered faintly before fading into silence. Around them, the passengers sat frozen, the hum of the engines masking the sound of collective disbelief. The violence came like thunder after a long silence. Bryce lunged. The movement was fast, wild, driven by something deeper than rage, something unhinged. His hand clutched the broken glass stem like a dagger, knuckles pale, wrist still gushing from where Darius had twisted it earlier. But he didn't seem to feel the pain. His eyes burned with singular intent, locked on Darius like prey marked in red. Darius moved on instinct. His hand shot up just in time, gripping Bryce's wrist with a crushing force born not of panic, but focus. Blood from both men smeared across their hands, making the struggle slick and brutal. The shard shimmered in the overhead cabin light, trembling inches from Darius's cheekbone. He could smell Bryce's breath, metallic, fast, unhinged. With a grunt, Darius shifted his weight and twisted. There was a sickening crunch as Bryce's hand contorted in the wrong direction. The jagged stem plunged, not into Darius, but into Bryce's own palm. It tore through flesh and sinew like wet paper. Bryce let out a piercing scream, his body jolting backward as blood sprayed across the aisle wall. Passengers shouted. A woman covered her face with trembling hands. A man 2 rows back stood halfway up before collapsing back into his seat at Bryce's barked warning. The air was heavy with disbelief, the kind that settles in right before the brain catches up to terror. Bryce stumbled, his wounded hand curling like a dying claw, but he wasn't finished. "Get back," a voice yelled, though it was unclear to whom. Bryce dropped to his knees, grabbing another glass shard from the floor with his good hand. The motion was so fast, so desperate, it barely registered. He scrambled forward, a wounded animal, blood trailing behind him in uneven smears. His eyes were wide, wild, but focused only on one thing, Darius. Darius braced, heart pounding not from fear, but calculation. The moment Bryce swung again, Darius ducked. He felt the rush of air as the jagged piece sliced through the space where his face had been a second earlier. He twisted, hooked Bryce's arm at the elbow, and slammed it with sharp precision against the edge of the nearby metal divider. The glass dropped with a clink. Bryce howled, stumbling back against the cabin wall, sliding down to one knee. His arms dangled uselessly, the skin shredded and pulsing with crimson. He stared at Darius with something new, something almost like disbelief, like a man waking from a trance and realizing he was still trapped inside it. "Sit down," Darius growled, voice steady, firm, and terrifyingly calm. His voice cut through the chaos like a steel blade. For a second, it worked. Bryce froze. His body trembled, blood dripping to the carpet in heavy dots. Then, footsteps. Felix. The junior flight attendant rushed forward from the galley, his pale face slick with sweat. He looked like a man who wanted to vanish, yet somehow found the strength to act. He stepped between them, arms out awkwardly, eyes darting between the two as if unsure which one was more dangerous. "Please, enough," Felix cried. "Everyone just stop." The cabin smelled of fear now. Blood, sweat, and tension fused in the air like a wire stretched to snapping. Overhead, the speaker crackled with the pilot's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. We're experiencing some turbulence." He didn't know. Nobody in the cockpit knew what was happening in first class. The pilot's calm tone was the cruelest irony in the world. Darius backed away slightly, never taking his eyes off Bryce. His lips were torn, his gums raw. He reached up slowly like someone operating on muscle memory and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Blood smeared across his skin. Then he leaned forward, opened his mouth over the tray table, and spat out something hard. Glass. Tiny, glinting pieces clattered onto the metal tray like teeth ripped from a monster. He blinked through the pain, breathing heavy but measured. Even now, clarity pulsed behind his eyes. Felix crouched beside Bryce, reaching out. "We need help." "We need to get him." Bryce flinched. "Don't touch me," he snarled, his voice breaking into a half-sob, half-snarl. He leaned his head back against the cabin wall, chest rising in fast, shallow waves. His pupils darted from Darius to the window, as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. Passengers whispered behind their hands. Phones were raised, filming. The truth was bleeding into every lens, staining every digital frame with something more than violence, something calculated. Darius didn't move again. He stood tall in the aisle, gripping the back of the seat in front of him, keeping himself steady as the plane hit a light bump. His face ached. His lips throbbed. His hands were numb from tension. But his mind, sharp. He looked down at Bryce, who now clutched his ruined hand, whispering to no one. Felix stood between them still, one hand held out like a guard trying to protect a line of peace that had already been trampled. He stared at Darius, eyes wide and full of unspoken things, regret, fear, knowledge. Darius exhaled once, slowly, then spoke again. "Sit down now." The weight of his words didn't just press into Bryce, it blanketed the cabin. Felix nodded faintly, not even realizing he was responding. He eased Bryce further back toward the jump seat, where others soon rushed in to restrain him. Darius remained standing, blood on his chin, fragments on his tray, his eyes burning, not with pain, but with control. And as he stood there, steady as the storm outside the fuselage rumbled closer, he realized something deeper was beneath this violence, something more orchestrated than chaos. But that would come later. For now, he remained locked in the moment, unblinking. Sometimes control is the sharpest weapon a man can wield. The blood hadn't dried yet. The copper sting still clung to the air as the captain's voice echoed through the cabin, calm but clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical emergency, we are diverting to the nearest airport. Emergency. We will be diverting to Holborn International. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement did little to settle the charged tension hanging over first class. Every pair of eyes flicked between Darius Lennox, his lips torn, his shirt soaked in red, and the restrained flight attendant slumped in the jump seat, whispering to no one. Bryce Halden rocked slightly in place, hands bound by flex cuffs, his eyes unfocused but twitching with some kind of internal dialogue. Felix, the younger attendant, stood nearby with trembling hands, eyes darting toward Darius as if silently asking for permission to breathe. The cabin lights dimmed for descent, casting long shadows across Bryce's face, making the streaks of blood down his wrist look like war paint. Darius pressed the edge of a napkin against his lower lip, absorbing what he could of the bleeding. His reflection in the tray table's gloss was unsettling, his usually composed expression now marred by rage and restraint. Yet his thoughts weren't on pain. They were on the fragments he had heard. "You're on the list. Make it look reactive." He hadn't imagined them. He was certain. Darius's mind began to sort them like puzzle pieces, sliding possibilities into place. It wasn't just about the broken glass, not just a moment of prejudice or rage. There was something underneath, something prepared. Felix cautiously stepped closer, voice barely audible over the engine hum. "Mr. Lennox, do you need anything? Ice? Gauze?" Darius looked up, steady and calm. "Stay with him. Don't leave him alone," he said, nodding toward Bryce. Felix blinked. "Why?" "Because if what he just said is real, he's not just a man who snapped. He's a message." The descent began. The plane trembled softly, but not from turbulence. It was the tension, thick, breathing, aware. Passengers in first class began murmuring. Some were crying softly. Others held up phones, unsure whether to keep filming or offer help. Across the aisle, a man in a business suit leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "That's Darius Lennox, right? The Virion guy?" The name was spreading, but Bryce kept muttering. "They said it wouldn't hurt him. Not like this. Not like this." His voice was gravel, soft and broken, barely audible over the rumble of the landing gear. Darius turned slowly toward him. "Who said that?" he asked, his voice even but firm. "Who told you anything?" Bryce didn't answer. He just closed his eyes and whispered, "It wasn't random. They picked you. They said you'd break easy." Darius's pulse surged, not with fear, but confirmation. It had been targeted. This wasn't personal hatred. It was coordinated, planned, and possibly much larger than anyone aboard realized. The wheels struck the tarmac hard, jolting everyone. The pilot's voice returned. "We've landed at Holborn. Medical and security teams are on standby. Do not leave your seats until instructed." The cabin erupted with noise as soon as the engines powered down. Felix leaned over and unlatched the door, motioning to the terminal. Outside, blue-uniformed emergency crews and a squad of security officers began boarding. Darius stayed seated. His body ached, especially his face, but his mind raced. He knew something now that no one else did, and it terrified him more than the assault. As two medics approached with a stretcher, Bryce jolted violently in his restraints, shouting, "He's got the case! Check his bag! The case! He had it with him!" Darius's stomach turned cold. The briefcase. His eyes swept the area beneath his seat. Gone. "No," he said under his breath, heart climbing into his throat. "No, no, no." He stood up sharply despite the medic's protest, searching the floor, the storage bin above, the corners of his seat. Nothing. "Felix," he said, "did you see my case?" Black, leather, 2 coated locks. Felix shook his head. I thought it was under your seat. I didn't see anyone." Bryce was still screaming. "They wanted what's inside. That's why. It wasn't me. I was the arm, not the hand." The medics tried to calm him, but Darius barely heard. His thoughts spiraled. That briefcase didn't carry contracts or notes. It carried encrypted schematics for Virion's upcoming AI governance chip, a system that could autonomously audit digital ecosystems for corruption, fraud, and abuse, a system that threatened every dishonest network and shadow partner in the corporate sector. Whoever stole it didn't want to destroy Darius. They wanted to disarm him. One of the security officers, a large man with silver-rimmed glasses and a pressed badge that read Officer Van, approached. "Sir, I need a statement." "We've restrained the suspect. We'll escort you to a private room for debrief." Darius didn't move. "I want cabin footage pulled. I want to see who touched my seat." Van's expression didn't shift. "Unfortunately, the system failed mid-flight. Technical fault. There's no usable recording." Darius's eyes narrowed. "Convenient." Van offered a weak smile. "Coincidences happen." "No," Darius muttered, voice cold. "Patterns happen. Coincidences just dress like them." As paramedics ushered Bryce past him, the flight attendant looked up once more. His pupils were wide, disconnected, yet behind them was a flicker of clarity, a glint that said he knew exactly what he'd done and what was coming next. "They said make it look reactive," Bryce rasped one last time. "Make him look like the threat." Then vanish. Darius's heart pounded. He stood still, body rigid, blood dripping slowly from his chin as the jet bridge door opened to floodlight and flashing reds. But his mind was miles ahead, already charting the storm he knew had just begun. The broken glass wasn't the weapon. It was the warning. And Bryce Halden, restrained and bloodied, wasn't the real enemy. He was the signal flare. What began as an assault had just become a coded message written in violence. The moment the plane's wheels hit the tarmac at Holborn International, the cabin lurched slightly, and Darius's world narrowed to the dull ache in his jaw and the coppery tang of blood still coating his tongue. The lights overhead flickered once as the aircraft slowed to a taxiing crawl. Then came the unmistakable shuffle of urgency, boots pounding the jet bridge, voices muffled through reinforced doors. A moment later, they were aboard. 4 security officers in Navy aviation response uniforms moved briskly through the narrow aisle. One of them, a stocky man with a pale buzz cut and the badge of lead authority, strode straight to the first-class section, where Bryce Halden sat restrained by a seatbelt, head twitching, hands trembling in bloodied latex gloves. Bryce's lips curled back in a distorted grin, eyes darting with wild energy as if trapped in a storm only he could see. "I have secondary clearance," he hissed to no one in particular. "Authorization was logged." "You'll see. It was approved." The officers barely acknowledged his ramblings. They pulled him to his feet, cuffing his wrists with professional swiftness. Bryce didn't resist. He just continued muttering under his breath, eyes locked on Darius as he was dragged past. "He's not supposed to land here." "He's not supposed to talk," Bryce whispered hoarsely, more to himself than anyone else. Darius, still seated and holding a gauze compress to his mouth, looked over at Felix Crane, the junior flight attendant. The young man stood off to the side, pale and shaking. Darius's voice came out low but firm. "Where's my briefcase?" Felix blinked as if emerging from a daze. I saw Bryce take something before it happened. Right before." His voice broke into a whisper. "Sir, I think Bryce took your case before the altercation." Everything in Darius's chest compressed. That case hadn't just held notes or speech drafts, it had contained the final encrypted blueprints of Virion's AI governance chip, a system designed to identify and audit unethical algorithms in real time. It was the kind of innovation that would upend entire industries and threaten powerful stakeholders in both private and governmental circles. He stood slowly, legs aching, face throbbing, but spine straight. "I want that plane sealed. I want footage from every angle, every recording." At the terminal, a sterile cordon had been assembled. Agents in plain black suits with clipped earpieces waited beyond the gate. The medics attending to Darius urged him toward the exit, but he held up a hand. "Not until I have confirmation my briefcase is secure." One of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the badge of Homeland Aero Federal Division, stepped forward. "Mr. Lennox, I'm Officer Van. We need to get you cleared and checked by medical personnel. We'll handle the rest." "I want to see the cabin recordings," Darius repeated. Officer Van's expression didn't change. "Unfortunately, the internal system failed mid-flight. Cabin feed went down. We believe it's a technical issue." Darius stared at him. Not a twitch, not a blink. The man delivered the lie as smoothly as reciting weather conditions, but Darius had led too many audits not to recognize rehearsed misdirection. "No feed," he said quietly, as if testing the words. "That's convenient." Van tilted his head. "Just unfortunate timing." Behind them, one of the paramedics tapped Darius's shoulder. "Sir, your mouth needs suturing. We need to get you off the tarmac." Still watching Van, Darius let himself be guided, but his mind was already racing. A missing briefcase, a staged outburst, a planted flight attendant. No video evidence. It wasn't paranoia anymore. This had never been just personal. It was orchestrated. As he was helped down the stairs and into the waiting ambulance, he glanced once more over his shoulder. Bryce, now nearly out of sight, twisted in his restraints as he was shoved into a different vehicle. His voice, though faint, carried through the late afternoon air. "Not random. He's on the list. They said make it look reactive." Darius didn't flinch, but inside, everything shifted. The blood on his shirt no longer symbolized a single act of hatred. It was the mark of a deeper conspiracy. At the terminal, agents began asking questions, but their focus on Bryce's psychological state seemed oddly rehearsed. When Darius requested to view the onboard footage, the lead investigator, a man named Officer Van, claimed the cabin's cameras had malfunctioned. Darius read the lie in his tone instantly. The real turbulence was only beginning. Darius jolted upright in the hospital bed as the nurse entered, clipboard in one hand, discharge packet in the other. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting sterile white beams across the room's tiled floor. The hum of machines provided a dull backdrop as she approached with a practiced smile. "Here are your papers, Mr. Lennox," she said gently, placing the folder on his lap. "Thanks," Darius replied, his voice hoarse, his lips still stitched and tender. He waited until she left before opening the folder. Between the sheets of printed forms, something slipped free. A folded piece of paper, thin and creased as if it had been hidden in haste. He unfolded it slowly. A few words were scrawled in uneven ink. "They used me. They'll silence you next." There was no name, just two faint initials in the corner. F.C. His chest tightened. Felix Crane, the younger flight attendant. So he was still alive. Darius stared at the message for several seconds, his thoughts shifting into motion like gears finally catching. Felix had risked slipping this into hospital documents, meaning he knew surveillance might be watching, meaning he was afraid. Every syllable now pulsed with urgency. Darius glanced toward the hallway, then folded the note and tucked it beneath his mattress. He didn't rest that night. He didn't even close his eyes. The next morning, sunlight bled through the window blinds in narrow lines, striping the wall like prison bars. Darius sat hunched over his tablet, reviewing his flight timeline when his device vibrated. An unlisted number flashed on screen. He hesitated, then answered. A male voice came through, distorted through what sounded like a voice mask. "Is this Mr. Lennox?" "It is," Darius said calmly. "I'm a friend," the man continued. "You don't know me, but I know what happened on Flight 612. Darius's hand stilled. "Go on." "I have documents, internal memos from Ariscorp," the voice said. "The incident wasn't isolated. You were part of a test. A stress test." "A what?" "Behavioral provocation trials," the man explained. "They targeted certain executives during flights, pushed them, filmed their reactions, then buried the results if things went too far." Darius's heart beat harder. "Why me?" You're about to speak at the Global Ethics Forum. You've been making enemies with that new AI chip of yours, the governance audit design. That chip threatens too many black budget systems. And who are you? There was a pause. Callan Rourke. I'm a journalist, off-grid. I intercepted a leak from a partner airline server 2 weeks ago. I was trying to verify it when your name showed up in the manifest list. Darius pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling the pressure pulse behind his temples. What exactly did the document say? That Flight 612 was labeled as a Level 3 executive interaction. Bryce Halden was inserted as an operative. Felix was never told the full plan. Only Halden knew. You were meant to be provoked, publicly. Anything violent would destroy your reputation. But Halden went too far. Darius didn't respond right away. His mind raced through the sequence. The skipped drink service, the cracked glass, the planted aggression. He had stayed calm until his mouth filled with blood and glass. "Send me the files," Darius said finally. "I can't. Too risky," Callan replied, "but I'll meet you." Tonight, 10 p.m., Dockside Cafe near the harbor. Come alone. The line cut. Darius stared at the screen, a knot forming in his gut. This wasn't just about a deranged flight attendant anymore. It was a blueprint, one that had been tested on him. That evening, the sky hung low over the city. A thin veil of fog crept along the waterfront as Darius stepped into the dimly lit cafe. His movements cautious but purposeful. A lone man in a gray coat sat in the back, sipping from a chipped mug. "Mr. Lennox," Callan greeted as Darius approached. "You always meet in coffee shops?" Darius asked dryly. Callan smiled faintly. "Only when I expect someone might try to follow me." He slid a flash drive across the table. Encrypted, 3 folders. One shows the operation planning. The second outlines the behavioral metrics they track, things like voice pitch under pressure, eye contact during confrontation. The third, that one lists targets, executives, all male, all high-ranking, all with upcoming visibility at global events, and me, marked as a termination-ready profile. Darius felt his hands clench beneath the table. Before he could speak, Callan's eyes flicked toward the window. "Don't look now, but a black SUV just pulled up. 2 men, no uniforms. They're watching the door." Darius nodded subtly, his breath steadying. "You come prepared." "I left a dummy drive in my coat pocket," Callan whispered. "Let them take it." They stood in sync, moving toward the cafe's back exit. The alley beyond was damp and shadowed. As they stepped into the narrow corridor, Darius could hear the soft crunch of approaching footsteps on gravel at the front. They didn't run. Instead, they slipped into the shadows, disappearing behind the dumpsters lining the back gate. Darius clutched the real drive tightly in his coat pocket, his breath fogging in the cool night air. Minutes later, a figure in a black security jacket entered the cafe. He bent over the seat Callan had occupied and retrieved the coat. He left with it, never noticing the empty table by the kitchen exit. From the alleyway, Darius watched him leave. "They think they're winning," Callan whispered. "Good," Darius replied, narrowing his eyes. "Let them think that." They parted without words. Darius stood alone beneath a flickering lamppost. Drive secure, truth within reach, but danger now closer than ever. What was meant to break him had only made him start hunting. He smashed a glass in his hand and rammed the jagged edge into the CEO's mouth, blood spilling as the cabin froze in horror. If you believe no power justifies violence, hit subscribe now, because justice bleeds truth, not fear. The spoon trembled in Darius's hand the moment he saw it, reflected in the polished silverware just off the lip of his untouched coffee. A black SUV, windows tinted so dark they absorbed the glow of the street lamps, had slowed outside the cafe. It didn't brake. It hovered, a presence without form. He didn't look up immediately. His fingers relaxed around the spoon as if he'd seen nothing. "We're being watched," he said quietly. Callan Rourke froze mid-sentence. The reporter's voice had just been rising in urgency, reciting a list of keywords he'd found in the encrypted documents. Behavioral extraction. Phase 3, reactive targeting. Now, that urgency gave way to a razor-edge silence. "You sure?" Callan's voice dropped to a whisper, his shoulders shrinking into his coat. Darius nodded once, eyes never leaving the reflection. "Third pass since we sat down. Same make, no plates." The Harbor Cafe was nearly empty, save for a teenage barista wiping the counter and a middle-aged man tapping away on a laptop in the corner. Outside, fog drifted in slow ribbons over the waterfront street. A perfect view of nothing. A perfect blind. Callan slid the encrypted USB drive across the table, wrapped in a napkin. His fingers shook despite his effort to appear calm. "That contains AerisCorp internal comms, flight logs, test protocols, code names. Your flight was labeled Variant Delta 17. He glanced toward the window, then added, "And Bryce Halden wasn't his real name." Darius picked up the napkin with casual precision, folding it into his coat pocket like a receipt. But his thoughts raced. Every word from Callan confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a strike, planned, rehearsed, and deployed with scientific cruelty. He had walked into a lab wearing a first-class seatbelt. A faint clicking noise broke the air as the cafe's front door creaked open slightly, just enough to break the seal. The SUV hadn't stopped, but a figure now stood at the edge of the sidewalk, wearing a dark security jacket. No insignia. Head tilted as if waiting for a signal. Not a thug. Not random. Trained. Darius's jaw tightened. Time to go. They stood in unison. Callan hesitated, staring at the figure beyond the glass. "What about the—" "I left a copy in a dead drop," Darius interrupted. "The one you gave me stays with them." Callan blinked, realization dawning. "It's a decoy." Darius nodded. "Encrypted with a recursive loop. Once they open it, all they'll see is half-truths, enough to keep them looking." They moved fast. Through the rear kitchen, past racks of flour-dusted pans and bins of produce, out the back exit into a narrow alley soaked in mist. Their footsteps echoed between brick walls, the scent of salt water and engine oil thick in the air. Behind them, a soft chime signaled the cafe's front door opening fully. Darius didn't look back. They split up at the next intersection, Callan ducking into a taxi he'd parked in advance, Darius vanishing into the rows of shipping containers beyond the dockyard fence. Minutes later, the SUV rolled to a stop in front of the cafe. The man in the security jacket entered, calm and methodical. He walked to the table, scanned it once, then picked up the napkin-wrapped drive. He smiled. But it wasn't victory. It was the bait being taken. Hours earlier, Darius and Raymond Holt had run Bryce Halden's personnel file through every internal and federal database they could access. What they found wasn't just suspicious, it was hollow. The employment records only went back 6 months. Prior residences were listed as unverified. No known relatives, no social footprint, no employment history before joining AerisCorp's affiliate airline. It was a ghost file. Raymond's voice over the encrypted call had been low and steady. "This isn't a background, it's a backfill." The kind contractors use when they need plausible deniability. Darius stared at the digital trail leading into the abyss. Where does it end? A server in Stuttgart, tagged to a shell company that rents office space out of the Nixon Systems building. That name dropped like lead in Darius's chest. Nixon Systems. The same defense subcontractor that had been publicly humiliated 2 weeks prior when Virion Systems, under Darius's leadership, won a federal AI ethics contract worth over $200 million. Nixon had claimed bias. They'd filed appeals. They'd lost. And now one of their former employees had tried to silence Darius midair. It wasn't retaliation. It was damage control, with blood as the cleanup tool. As Darius weaved through the foggy container yard alone now, he pieced together the fragments. Behavioral Extraction Trials. Phase 3. The label on Callan's drive wasn't accidental. It meant there had been earlier phases, that the program had evolved, that he was a subject in something far more dangerous than an attack. He passed a floodlight, its yellow glow casting elongated shadows across the gravel lot. Somewhere behind him, a distant engine idled, but didn't move. He ducked behind a stack of pallets, breath steady, heart pounding not from fear, but from clarity. This was no longer about justice for an assault. This was war against invisibility, against a hidden structure feeding on reputation, perception, and fear. In the distance, the SUV pulled away, satisfied with its retrieval. But what it carried was only half of the truth. The other half was now burning quietly in a secure drive, and the trap had been set. Darius adjusted the collar of his coat and melted deeper into the yard's shadows, disappearing before the next phase could begin. Sometimes the trap must be baited with truth to catch lies. The call came just after midnight, piercing the silence of Darius's apartment like a scalpel. His phone vibrated once, twice, then settled. No ID. A disposable number. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then answered. "They told me to stay quiet," the voice whispered. It was Felix Crane. Darius sat upright in the dim light of his study. "Felix, where are you?" "They're watching. I don't have long," Felix stammered, his voice cracked, trembling not just from fear, but guilt. Darius's pulse quickened. "Talk to me." "What did they do?" Felix exhaled shakily. "Bryce wasn't supposed to go that far. They told him just to rattle you, just enough to get you angry, not to break a glass in your mouth." "Who told him?" A pause. Darius could hear Felix's breaths, short, clipped, as if he were speaking from a parking lot, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. "Men in suits." "3 of them. They showed up 2 hours before we boarded, said it was a behavioral calibration, said it was confidential protocol from upper-tier partnership clearance." He was rambling now. "They gave Bryce something. A packet, sealed. I didn't look, I swear, but he read it, and something changed. He started pacing. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Darius closed his eyes, visualizing the moments before takeoff. Bryce's stares, the sharp movements. It had all been premeditated. Felix continued, lower now. "They said they wanted to measure executive response under racial provocation." Those were the exact words. Darius gripped the edge of his desk. "And after?" "After we landed," Felix whispered, "I saw Officer Van on the tarmac." He wasn't reacting to the chaos like it was new to him. He kept checking his phone. Then I heard it, just once, his earpiece. A voice said, "Operation coverage confirmed." And he nodded. Like it was routine, Darius's hand froze mid-air. "You're saying Van knew?" "Yes. And more than that, I think he was briefed beforehand." Felix's voice trembled now, unsteady and strained. "Darius, you're not the only one." I overheard them mention Trial 14, like it was part of a series. The room around Darius felt suddenly smaller. "I need to meet you," he said. "Now. Somewhere safe. You can't run forever." I know," Felix replied. "But I'm scared. I think they're following me. I keep seeing the same car, black, no plates, near my apartment." There was a rustling sound, then the scrape of a zipper. "I saved what I could." A voice memo Bryce left on his device. He said he didn't want to do it, but he needed the payout. Felix, static. The call cut. Darius pulled the phone back, stared at the blank screen. Signal lost. He immediately traced the call through his security app. Nothing. It was a burn phone. One-time signal burst. He didn't sleep. By morning, the news had already broken. A body had been discovered behind the airport's north service lot. Male, early 20s. Name withheld pending investigation. Darius's stomach sank. He didn't wait for confirmation. An hour later, a police liaison named Officer Nels called to inform him of Felix Crane's death. Apparent suicide, the officer said with routine coldness. Found in his vehicle. Carbon monoxide poisoning. No note, Darius asked tightly. No note. Just a sealed envelope in the glove box. Empty. Where's the body? Transferred to Holborn Medical for autopsy, Nels replied. Standard protocol. But Darius knew what this was. There were no coincidences in engineered violence. Felix had known too much and tried to do the right thing. That alone had marked him for erasure. He leaned back in his chair, the memory of Felix's voice replaying in his ears. They said you'd just get rattled. Number. They had wanted much more. They had wanted him discredited, reactive, broken in public. Instead, Felix had broken script. And now he was dead. Darius walked to the window of his office. Below, the city pulsed with routine. Coffee vendors opening stalls, commuters streaming past in quiet rhythm. None of them knew the war being waged in whispers above their heads. He clenched his jaw. This wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't even about Virion's tech or the sabotaged flight. It was about control, about using people like Felix, expendable, and men like Darius, targeted, to feed a system that demanded silence and obedience. He would not be silent. He would not obey. He picked up his recorder, opened a new voice log, and began documenting every word of the call, every detail Felix had mentioned. His story would not end in a headline labeled suicide. It would begin there. The window outside reflected his face, scar still fresh from Bryce's attack, eyes sharpened not by revenge, but by purpose. When truth becomes dangerous, silence becomes a weapon. The leak began with a quiet upload to 3 servers in 3 different countries. Darius sat alone in a low-lit study, a gray hoodie draped over his shoulders, the warm light from the desk lamp flickering against the tense lines on his face. He hovered over the keyboard, finger paused above the return key. One tap, and fragments of the truth would scatter into the hands of journalists, watchdogs, and independent platforms across the world. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to ignite questions, enough to draw eyes toward the shadows. He tapped. Within minutes, a wave began to ripple. The documents contained redacted names, blurred audio clips, and metadata from Felix's encrypted notes, proof of interference, coded behavioral directives, and psychological profiling operations mid-flight. Darius made sure none of it pointed directly to him. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was setting the stage. By sunrise, Ariscorp and Nixian systems were thrust into the public spotlight. Talk shows buzzed. Analysts speculated. But beneath the surface, the reactions were surgical. Officer Van, the investigator who had first deflected Darius's questions about the missing cabin footage, resigned without warning. The official statement cited medical reasons. Darius knew better. That same day, Bryce Halden was declared mentally unfit for trial by a sudden team of lawyers who hadn't existed a week prior. He was transferred quietly to a private psychiatric institution. No reporters allowed. No statements issued. The courtroom would never hear testimony. The man who assaulted Darius would never stand trial. But Darius wasn't finished. He met Raymond Holt at a secure private lab built below Virion's satellite research campus. As the building vibrated faintly with the hum of mainframe servers, Raymond leaned forward, typing commands with surgical precision. The files Callan had sent were more than whistleblower notes. They were a cipher. "It's buried in layers," Raymond muttered, sweat gathering at his temple. "But it's not random." Someone wanted us to find this. Darius stood behind him, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Show me." One final keystroke decrypted the last wall. The screen shifted, revealing a classified document titled Project Redline. Phase Structure Overview. They read in silence. It was all there: government seals, defense contractor headers, timestamps, behavioral triggers, neurological response logs. The program was a collaboration between private security agencies and select corporate partners. Its objective was both precise and disturbing: simulate real-world confrontations targeting high-profile executives, observe their reactions under staged threats, and use the data to refine predictive behavioral models for both civilian and military use. Darius's breath stilled. His file was the third listed. The header read, Trial 03. Subject, D. Lennox. Status, elevated response, controlled de-escalation. Observation complete. "They were watching you the whole time," Raymond said quietly, "measuring how far you'd go before fighting back." Darius turned toward the frosted glass window, his reflection distorted in the pane. He could still feel the sting in his cheek, the sharp line that ran from the corner of his mouth up toward his cheekbone. The scar hadn't healed clean. He had refused cosmetic treatment. He didn't want it gone. He wanted it remembered. 17, Raymond added. 17 trials. You were number 3. That means there are 14 others out there who have no idea what was done to them. Darius's mind surged with names: other CEOs, public figures, government speakers who had suddenly disappeared from media, taken abrupt leaves, or faced controversy following unexplained incidents. "I need to talk to Callan again," Darius said. Raymond hesitated. "They're watching." "You leak too much, too fast. They'll know it's you." "I'm not leaking," Darius replied. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried the quiet rage of a man who had seen beneath the mask. "I'm documenting." That night, Darius returned to his penthouse and stood before the bathroom mirror. He leaned forward slowly, gaze locked on the scar that split his cheek like a whispered accusation. For a long time, he didn't blink. Then he whispered, "Some scars aren't reminders of pain. They're signatures of truth carved into the skin of silence." The moment the exposé dropped, the air changed. Callan Rourke's article, titled Passengers as Subjects, The Quiet Skies of Experimentation, landed like a shockwave. It was front-page material, cold, clinical, and damning. With precision, it laid bare a network of behavioral simulations orchestrated mid-flight, naming no one directly, but detailing operations unmistakably similar to what had happened to Darius Lennox aboard Flight 612. Anonymous whistleblowers described interactions calibrated to provoke high-profile individuals into overreaction. Data was collected. Reputations risked. Silence bought and archived. And now, for the first time, the silence was breaking. Within hours, Ariscorp released a public statement. "We deeply regret the incident involving Mr. Lennox and are conducting a full internal review. Initial findings suggest the actions of a mentally unwell employee. There is no evidence linking this to any formal program, nor any connection with Nixon Systems or other partners. We remain committed to the highest ethical standards." Darius sat in the green room of a television studio when he read those words on his phone. He didn't blink, didn't scoff. Instead, he handed the phone back to his assistant, adjusted his tie, and stood when the producer waved him toward the stage. The interview segment had been scheduled weeks prior to discuss automation ethics, but now the topic had shifted, and Darius was ready to face it head-on. On stage, under the lights, he spoke with calm precision. "If the sky has become a laboratory," he said, his voice steady, "then every passenger is a subject." The host leaned in, stunned. "Are you saying this wasn't an isolated act of violence?" "I'm saying," Darius replied, locking eyes with the camera, "that I have reasons to believe this was designed, tested, recorded, and that others may be next." The quote trended within minutes. Hashtags surged. Advocacy groups picked it up. Politicians began releasing vague statements about accountability in transportation oversight. What Darius had just done, intentionally, was ignite something no public relations team could extinguish. But the fire brought shadows with it. 2 days later, as Darius exited the Virion Systems headquarters in Central Vale, a black SUV sat quietly across the street. Not running, not marked, just parked. The next night, it was a silver sedan, tinted windows, idling down the block from his apartment building. At first, he said nothing. He took alternate routes to work, changed routines. But it wasn't just him anymore. His head of security, Brenson, noticed them too. "You're being tailed," Brenson muttered one evening as they rode the elevator down from Darius's office. Not amateurs either. No plates, no pattern. Surveillance grade. "I expected this," Darius said quietly. Back in his penthouse apartment, the lights from the city bled through the glass walls, but Darius remained in the shadows. He poured a glass of water and stared at the scar on his cheek in the reflection. It had begun to fade, but it throbbed sometimes, especially when he touched the memory behind it. His phone buzzed. Another message from Callan. "They're trying to spin the whole story. Ariscorp's denying everything. Nixon's silent. But I have more. 3 new sources. I'll keep digging." Darius typed back, "Proceed carefully." They're watching. Later that night, he opened an unmarked envelope that had arrived with his name typed on it. No return address. Inside was a grainy photo. It showed Bryce Halden, months before the incident, entering a building with a sign barely legible. Redline Diagnostics. Below the photo was a scribbled note. Patient or employee. Either way, he was prepped. That night, sleep didn't come. At a private strategy meeting the following morning, Raymond Holt laid out a plan. "We'll anonymize the rest of the data and push it to 3 separate independent outlets. Simultaneously, if we release everything at once, it'll scatter their control." He clicked through slides of redacted memos and chain-of-command breakdowns, threads of a tapestry too large to burn cleanly. Darius nodded. "Do it." Still, the danger wasn't theoretical anymore. That evening, he opened his front door to find the doorman unconscious, slumped in his seat. No robbery, no forced entry. Just a message left on his kitchen counter. "You're not cleared for this altitude." He reported nothing. The next day, a courier delivered a USB drive to Virion's front desk, addressed simply to the target. It contained only a short video clip. Him, seated on the plane, moments before Bryce attacked. There was no audio, and the angle wasn't from the official cabin camera. It was from the ventilation duct. Someone had recorded the entire incident from above. Raymond watched it in silence. They had multiple feeds. This was part of the plan all along. And now, Darius asked, "Now they're showing you they still control the sky." Darius said nothing. He walked to the window, eyes tracing the contrails of aircraft slicing through the morning haze. That evening, his phone rang again. A new number. The voice on the line was calm, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Lennox, we advise you stop speaking publicly. We admire your discipline. Don't waste it." Darius hung up. Then he went back on air. "If the sky has become a laboratory," he repeated to the host that night, "then every passenger is a subject." His voice didn't tremble. His conviction didn't waver. The lights didn't flicker. But outside the studio, 2 vehicles waited in silence. Truth, once spoken aloud, can no longer be escorted off the plane. The guard's key clicked once and the door swung open with a muted creak. Darius Lennox stepped into the psychiatric observation room, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. The fluorescent lights above hummed quietly, casting a sterile, unforgiving glow over the pale walls. He'd insisted on coming alone, against his legal team's warnings, against every rational argument. But something in Bryce Halden's request, delivered through a public defender and phrased like a confession, had pulled him here. Bryce sat at the far end of the room, hunched in a wheelchair, bandaged hand trembling against the armrest like a ticking clock no one had wound properly. His face, once taut with smug aggression, had sunken. Hollow cheeks, eyes ringed in shadow. Whatever had driven him mad, or whatever had been done to him, was still echoing through his frame like a silent scream. "You came," Bryce murmured. Darius stood firm, hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. "You asked for me." Bryce tried to smile, but his lips only twitched. "They didn't think you would." "I nearly didn't," Darius replied, voice calm, steady. The room felt suspended in time. Outside the single observation window, 2 guards watched without blinking. A muted red light pulsed on a security panel above the door, recording. Bryce coughed lightly, then leaned forward. "They told me you'd be the final test," he whispered, eyes darting toward the glass. "That everything before you was calibration." Darius didn't flinch. "Who told you?" Bryce's eyes flicked toward the ceiling as if names might be etched into the tiles. The men in the gray coats. Not Ariscorp. Not even Nixian. Something deeper. They trained me for weeks. Monitored my responses. Said your profile was the pinnacle. If you stayed composed, the program had failed. "And if I didn't?" Darius asked, voice cold. Bryce looked down at his trembling hand. "Then they'd roll it out wide." Silence sat heavy between them, the kind that made every second louder than the last. Darius took a slow step closer. "And what did they say would happen to you if you failed?" Bryce blinked, and for the first time, his eyes showed something Darius hadn't expected. Fear, not manic paranoia, but childlike dread. "They said I'd disappear." There was no time to react, no chance to question further. A shrill, piercing tone exploded through the hall outside. The door behind Darius snapped open as 2 orderlies rushed in. Monitors beside Bryce's chair spiked, heart rate, respiration, before dropping rapidly. "He's crashing," one of the medics shouted. Bryce convulsed, his limbs jerking violently. Foam bubbled at his lips as his eyes rolled back. Darius stepped back instinctively as the team surged in, trying to stabilize him. A nurse pulled the crash cart forward, attaching pads to his chest, while another jabbed a syringe into the IV line. "Clear!" someone yelled. Darius's jaw clenched as the defibrillator fired. Bryce's body arched, then dropped. "Clear!" Another jolt. The machine screamed again, flatline. A third jolt. Nothing. The doctor stepped in moments later, face grave. After a final round of silent effort, he shook his head. Time of death, 1842. Darius watched silently as the room cleared. The orderlies left. The guards resumed position. Bryce lay motionless, a strange peace now carved across his broken features. Just as Darius turned to leave, the attending doctor stopped him. "Mr. Lennox," he said quietly, glancing at the observation window. "This was found on him. He clutched it when we brought him in last week. Said it wasn't to be touched until after." He extended a small object, an ordinary paper napkin, yellowed at the folds. Darius took it, instinctively recognizing the texture. Airline stock, from Flight 612. Unfolding it with care, his breath hitched. 3 large smeared letters marked the center in rust-colored dried blood. RLD. Darius's eyes darkened. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Behind him, the flatline beep continued faintly, echoing like a siren across a war zone that no one saw but him. The napkin trembled in his hand, not from fear, but from the clarity that this was no accident. It was a message, a brand, an unfinished sentence written in red. As he stepped out of the room, the hallway seemed colder, longer. Shadows stretched from corners that hadn't existed before. The air felt heavier with implication. Whatever the investigation uncovered next, he knew the truth was already bleeding through the cracks. Even in madness, fragments of truth still find their way home. The anonymous email arrived just past midnight. Darius Lennox sat alone in his home office, the overhead lights dimmed to a warm amber, casting long shadows across the walls lined with legal briefs, encrypted drives, and early concept sketches for what would become the Sentinel Initiative. The glow of his laptop screen illuminated his scarred cheek, a physical memory of the glass that had shattered his peace months ago. The subject line read only, "Resurgence." He opened it. No sender, no body text, just a single attachment. A compressed file labeled manifests_R_LD_XV, and a single line beneath it. They moved it offshore. His fingers hovered over the mouse, hesitation tingling in the air. Then he clicked. Dozens of flight numbers unfolded on the screen, none domestic, each paired with passenger lists, timestamps, and flagged tags: OBSSIM, TRGRSP, PULSEBRKT. They were terms he recognized from Project Redline's own documentation, behavioral trigger codes used during simulated conflict events. But these weren't simulations. These were live. Darius leaned back, his heartbeat rising, the creak of his chair the only sound in the silence. He pinched the bridge of his nose, eyes stinging with exhaustion. The hearings had ended. The world had moved on. But clearly something hadn't. A knock at the glass startled him. Raymond Holt stood outside the sliding door, a manila folder in one hand, his eyes urgent. Darius waved him in. "You're not going to like what I'm about to show you," he said as Raymond stepped inside, brushing off the night rain from his blazer. Raymond scanned the email on screen, his expression hardening. This means they're still running the trials." "Not here," Darius muttered, "but somewhere with less oversight." Somewhere without congressional hearings or watchdog journalists, Raymond placed the folder on the desk. "Then we need to act faster." I pulled internal audits from Nixon's overseas subsidiaries, 2 of them rebranded under shell firms, 1 in the Azores, 1 in South Asia. No paper trail, but their funding patterns match Redline's ghost accounts. Darius flipped through the folder, page after page of blacked-out names, wire transfers, and falsified employment records. It was Redline, all right, only now it wore a different face. "How many victims?" he asked. "Too early to tell," Raymond said, "but one of the flagged names on this manifest is a climate scientist. Another's a journalist. They're not just targeting CEOs anymore." Darius clenched his fist. "They're expanding the net." Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Callan Rourke appeared in the doorway, laptop tucked under his arm. "We've got trouble," he said, eyes stormy. "One of our inside sources just went dark. He sent a partial voice note before disappearing. I think they found out he was working with us." "What did the message say?" Darius asked. Callan played the recording. The voice was distorted, panicked. "They've started flight trials again. New protocols. Psychological breach testing. Target group is broader, activists, whistleblowers. They're evolving it. I don't have much time." Static cut the rest. The room fell silent. "Do we go public again?" Raymond asked, but Darius shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Not yet. If we go public too soon, they'll vanish again. We leak this in layers. Controlled drops. Let public pressure build while we follow the money. If they've moved the program offshore, then we have to corner them where they think they're untouchable." Callan nodded, setting his laptop on the table. "I've got 2 reporters willing to run story fragments. No names attached. We plant the seeds, let them grow." Raymond added, "I'll reach out to our EU contact. See if there's a regulator willing to talk under closed doors." Darius stood, walking to the window. Outside, the city lights flickered, but above them, the sky was an endless black sheet. Somewhere out there, another plane was flying. Another test was underway. Another life was about to be shattered in the name of data. He closed his eyes, exhaling deeply. Every step forward revealed more shadows. Every victory brought a new layer of deception. But he wasn't the same man who boarded Flight 612. He turned back to his team, his allies, and nodded. We stay visible. We stay loud. If they've shifted tactics, so will we. Then he returned to his desk, closing the encrypted manifest and shutting his laptop. The sound of the latch clicking felt final, but his eyes betrayed no rest. Somewhere, just beyond the clouds, the enemy was still moving. Outside his window, the distant roar of a departing aircraft rose into the night. Justice had landed, but the storm above was only circling back. He filled another man's mouth with glass and screamed when the stem tore through his own cheek seconds later. If you believe every act of hate ends where it begins, subscribe now, because justice always breaks clean. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, humiliation, and the courage to confront injustice in unexpected moments. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on dignity, equality, and the need for accountability in positions of power.